Hi everybody, welcome back. On our last video, we demonstrated how to operate a sewing machine, and we did it by sewing this little felt pocket envelope here, and it kind of only felt natural to go ahead and finish that project by adding a button to the envelope and a buttonhole. So before we get started on that, there's going to be a few different items that I'm going to have handy. Our sewing needles, a piece of chalk, our seam ripper, a really good pair of scissors, a spool of thread. I'm going to go with white to match our seam, and you might not have one of these, but a needle threader. I'll show you how to use one of these today. So let's get started. Oh, and we'll need our buttons. So I've got a few different buttons to choose from. So we'll be hand sewing a button to our envelope, and we will be using the buttonhole stitch on our sewing machine. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do in order to thread our needle is get a piece of thread. So I'm going to unspool a piece of thread that is about the length of my arms from end to end. I'm going to cut that. Select the proper needle here. Okay, so there's not much to threading a needle. Clip your thread so you have a nice clean tip to your thread, and good lighting is going to help thread that needle a lot easier. Okay, so there. I've threaded my needle. Now I'll take one end and find the other end, match them up. Now I'm going to tie them in a double knot here. Try and get that knot on top of the other one. We want to create a knot at the end so our thread doesn't come unraveled from our project. Clean that up a little bit. Okay, now we let our needle fall to the center, and now we're ready to sew. I'm actually going to show you how to thread a needle using a needle threader. This is a needle threader. This is a really cool little tool. If you have trouble threading a needle on your own, there's this little wire piece on the end that you slip into the eye of the needle, and that is a lot easier to force through the eye of the needle than a piece of thread. So once you've slipped your needle threader through the eye of your needle, all you do is put a little bit of thread through that wire piece and then pull it out of the eye of the needle. It pulls the thread with it, and then there you go. you've threaded your needle. So a needle threader can be a really useful tool. It can make threading that needle a lot quicker if you want to use one of those. So now that we have our needle threaded and knotted at the end, let's go ahead and move on to the next step. Okay, so like I said, the idea is to add a button and a buttonhole to our little felt envelope here. So we're going to select a button. I'm going to go ahead and go with a white button to match my white thread, and that's going to contrast nicely against our navy blue felt. So when all is said and done, I want the button to be right about here. So I'm going to use my piece of chalk and trace that button. Okay, so what we're going to have to do is basically sew the button right underneath, right about here. And if we sew our button right here, when the flap closes, it should line up right about there. And we're also going to create our buttonhole right there. And then our button will go through that buttonhole. So let's start by sewing our button on. The most important thing to remember is that you have the end of your sewing thread knotted up. We have to have a knot at the end in order to keep the thread from coming through our fabric. The second most important thing to remember, as the needle is passing through the button, we have to make sure that it's only passing through this part of the fabric. Because if we accidentally sew it through both pieces of fabric, we will then have sewn our envelope shut and it won't open. So we have to be mindful that our thread is only passing through that front part of our envelope. So I'm going to go ahead and pick a spot to bring my needle through from the underneath. Gonna lay my button on top there. That looks pretty good. So now we're ready to start sewing. So we pull the thread through for our very first time until we reach that knot on the inside. We don't want to pull too hard because then it'll go right through. Now we're going to go through this opposite hole down here, the hole just below, because there's 4 holes here. We're going to go through that one and then pull our thread out the envelope, making sure that the thread is only passing through this front part of the flap, not both parts. Now when we come up this time, we're going to aim for this hole on the left here. And that can be a little tricky. It might take you a couple times to poke through until you find the right spot. Okay, there's our third hole. We don't want to pull the thread too tight. We want a little bit of movement in that button so it has a little bit of flex when we open and close our button, the flap of our envelope. Okay, so now we're passing through the 4th and final hole. Okay, so we've passed the thread through all 4 holes to secure the button in place, but that single pass is not going to be strong enough. We're going to need to do several passes. And then once we have about this much thread left over, we're going to stop, and then we're going to tie several knots in the end to keep it from unraveling. So let's go ahead and finish securing this button. We're going to repeat our pattern, top hole, bottom hole, left hole, right hole, until we have almost run out of thread. We don't want to use up all of our thread because we're going to need a little left over in order to tie a knot and secure that button, that thread, so it doesn't come unraveled. Okay, so I think my button is good and secure now, but we started by adding several knots to our thread to keep the fabric or the stitch from unraveling. Now we have to do the exact same thing. Now that we've finished, we're going to need to tie several knots in order for the thread holding the button to not come unraveled. So what you now have to do is, if you look in here, you might be able to see the white, kind of like the bunched up white thread of our button there. What we want to do is we want to pass the needle through that, pull it out, and then tie a knot into the thread that's left over. So I'll kind of show you what I mean by that. So I'm sticking the needle in there through that little pile of white thread there on the back side of our button. Now I pulled the needle out, and you see this loop that's closing up. I want to pass the needle through there to create a knot, and then slowly tighten that, and that is going to lock in that thread and hold that button in place. So I'm going to do it again here. Take the needle, pass it through that bunch of thread we have there, and a little bit into the fabric as well. That's going to help really secure that. Okay, so we created this loop. We want our needle to pass through that loop to create a knot as we tighten. There. Okay. So I've locked the thread in about 4 times. So we're gonna call that good. We're gonna clip this off. Put our needle someplace safe so we don't lose it. Now we have a button sewn into our envelope here. And when we close the flap, we can feel that, yeah, it still lines up in the same place. So the last thing that we're going to need to do is create that button hole right here for our button to pass through. So we'll go through the whole process of how to create a buttonhole and use the buttonhole stitch on a sewing machine next, and that will be the end of the project.